didn't have to have a correspondent there to pick up the international press conference because it was all over the wires and everything else.
Well, I'll ask you that.
Okay. Okay.
And today on A Public Affair, we're going to be talking with Noam Chomsky. He's an MIT professor of linguistics, and in that field, he revolutionized it in the 1960s. He's also written over a dozen books analyzing U.S. foreign policy and the media, including his latest work, Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of the Mass Media, co-authored with Edward Herman. Noam Chomsky, welcome.
Good to be here.
It's really good to have you here in person. The last time we were able to do this was 4 years ago, April 1st, 1985, a day that will live in infamy.
April Fool's Day.
Right. There's so much to try and pack into a little bit of time, but I want to plunge ahead and see how far we can get. You're considered by many, including myself, to be one of the most capable people in this country when it comes to offering an alternative to the mainstream analysis of national politics. When Jeff Greenfield was in town, I asked him, how could it be that you and others, and practically no other American for that matter, who's a critic of U.S. foreign policy, could be on what is called the premier daily news analysis program? And I wonder if we could just listen to a few minutes of what he had to say, and then we'll come back and talk.
Yeah.
What about just in the selection of guests to analyze things? Why is Noam Chomsky never on Nightline?
I couldn't begin to tell you.
He's one of the leading intellectuals in the entire world.
I have no idea. I mean, I can make some guesses. He may be one of the leading intellectuals who can't talk on television. You know, that's a standard that's very important to us. If you got a 22-minute show and a guy takes 5 minutes to warm up, now I don't know whether Chomsky does or not. He's out, and you can say that's a terrible value judgment. But we have on that one, the logistics drive it. One of the reasons why Nightline has the usual suspects is one of the things you have to do when you book a show is know that the person can make the point within the framework of television. And if people don't like that, they should understand it is about as sensible to book somebody who will take 8 minutes to give an answer as it is to book somebody who doesn't speak English. I'll bet you there are really smart people about all kinds of things in Turkey, Uzbekistan, West Germany, who can't speak English. We can't book them unless it's such an important guest that we would have a simultaneous translator. But in the normal given flow, that's another culture-bound thing. We got to have English-speaking people. We also need concision. It also may be that the bookers have talked to him and think he's no good. Or what I don't think it is really is a conscious notion that Chomsky's too far, too anti-Israel or too anything else. Because, I mean, if you look at, in that area at least, if that's the area we're talking about, I assume you mean Chomsky on the Middle East as opposed to linguistics. We don't do many linguistic shows. We have an awful lot of people on in that area who have a fairly wide range of views about that issue. But that's also, Ted Koppel is a pretty smart fella, and he has a lot to do with how the show is shaped. And since he's the anchor, he also has a perfect right to say, no, the show that I want to do, I see it going this way.
Remember the big blow-up when Brinkley interviewed Posner and Dornan got up on the floor of the House and he was ranting and raving and that whole thing? And ABC ended up apologizing and so forth. Yeah. I interviewed Chomsky at the time, and his comment was that one of the things that Posner was saying was we ought to, a test ban, a complete test ban is the way to go. And Chomsky was saying, well, it was okay to get Posner on. When will Americans be able to go on mainstream television and say those things, much less Russians?
That's idiotic. Maybe that's why we don't book Chomsky. If Chomsky thinks that an American can't get on American TV to say that, he's a fool on that issue. See, I was reading Chomsky 20 years ago. I think his notion, didn't he co-author a new book called Engineering Consent or The Manufacturing of Consent? I mean, some of that stuff to me looks like it's from Neptune. It just is so, and he's perfectly entitled to say that I'm seeing it through a prism too. But my view of that, of his notions about the limits of debate in this country is absolutely wacko, to quote Ed Koch.
Well, that was February 1st of this year, Noam.
Well, I don't want to talk, I won't respond to the vilification, but the first point that he made has something to it. See, for example, it's quite true that in other industrial democracies like Canada or England or the European countries or elsewhere, there's apparently no problem in my appearing on television and radio. I do it all the time, and not here. At least not here in the main centers. I might happen in Laramie, Wyoming, or Des Moines, Iowa, or something like that. And part of the reason that he gave is in fact accurate. His numbers were wrong, but unless you can say something in 2 minutes, you're not fit for Nightline. And there's a good reason for that. I think there's a structural reason for that. U.S. television is quite different from that in other industrial democracies. So it's perfectly true that when I go to, say, Belgium or London or some such place, or Toronto, and I appear on national television or national radio, I do not speak for 2 minutes. And the reason is because it's taken for granted. I mean, there's a very simple point that's taken for granted. In 2 minutes or 3 minutes, you can only produce conventional thoughts. If you say anything that's the slightest bit unconventional, you can't do it in 2 minutes because people will want to know why. They'll want to know your reasons. For example, if I was interviewed on Nightline and they were to ask me, what do you think about the Russian invasion of Afghanistan? In 2 minutes, I could say, look, yeah, I think it's terrible. I don't think the Russians should invade Afghanistan. They're awful people. They should withdraw, and so on and so forth. That I could say in 2 minutes. Suppose, however, that he asked me, what do you think about the U.S. defense of South Vietnam? And I had to answer and say there was no U.S. defense of South Vietnam any more than there's a Russian defense of Afghanistan. There was a U.S. attack against South Vietnam. If I were to say that, I couldn't do it in 2 minutes because it would sound, as he put it, wacko. The reason is it's unconventional. If you make conventional statements, you don't need evidence and you don't need arguments because everybody's heard them a million times. If you say anything unconventional, people can rightly ask, what are your reasons for saying that? And Nightline is designed so that you can't give those answers. Because those answers are going to take more than 2 minutes. That's why when you go to Canada, Spain, Belgium, England, any other country where they have national radio and television, they understand perfectly well that if you want to have opinion expressed that's meaningful, you don't try to compress it between two commercials. You give the person a chance to elaborate, explain, provide evidence, provide arguments, give some indication of why you're saying what you're saying. On this point, he's quite accurate, but he doesn't understand what he's saying, I don't think. It's perfectly true that they need, as he put it, concision, meaning they need conventionality. They need conventional opinions to be expressed because they require no evidence. It's just opinions. I've seen it. I rarely watch Nightline, but when some of my friends are on, like, say, Alex Coburn, I watch. And Alex, I think, is very good on television. But if I try to look at what Alex Coburn says from the point of view of the normal listener, I would also think it's wacko. Because what he's saying is so far away from anything they've ever heard that it just sounds off the wall. Now, crucially, he's not given time to explain why he said what he said. That's Greenfield's point. You're not allowed to be given time. And that itself it's a structural technique of indoctrination which is quite effective. And the United States is quite unusual in this respect. I don't know any other industrial democracy where this is true.
Mm-hmm. What about his point that he said that your theories on the limits of debate in this country, the very thing you've just been talking to, sounds like it's from Neptune or someplace like that?
Well, the answer, maybe it is from Neptune, but the way to deal with that question is to look at the facts, not to scream hysterically about it. So, for example, we can look at, say, the debate over the war in Vietnam. And we can see whether indeed it is true that the debate, as we claim in our book, and we spend a couple hundred pages documenting, that the debate was between those who said that with enough violence the United States could win, the hawks, and those who said that we probably weren't going to succeed, and besides it was getting a little too bloody, so our noble venture of defending South Vietnam would not succeed. We can, in fact, ask whether those were the limits of debate. Is it true, for example, that, say, Anthony Lewis was at the outer limits of debate with his view in 1975 that the United States entered with blundering efforts to do good, but by 1969 it became a disaster, so therefore it was bad? Is it true that Arthur Schlesinger was at the outer limits of debate when he said, we all pray that Mr. Alsop, the hawk, will be right, but I don't think he will be right. And if he turns out to be right, we will all be praising the wisdom and statesmanship of the American government in the defense of South Vietnam. Is that the outer limit of debate or isn't it? Well, that's a factual matter. We can find the answer to that question. I've done, Herman and I have both together and individually done extensive work showing that, in fact, those are the limits of debate. If he thinks that's wacko, fine, let's hear the evidence. Let me see the places in ABC television or the New York Times or the Washington Post where people discuss the U.S. attack against South Vietnam. I'm glad to look. I've been looking for years. I've never seen it, but maybe he's seen it. Fine. Now we're in the level of rational discussion. Now, my suspicion is he doesn't want to enter that arena. That's why you scream about Neptune and wacko and so on. That prevents you from entering makes it unnecessary. I mean, if you're talking to people who are insane, then obviously you don't try to give evidence and arguments. But I think if you look at that book and the by now literally thousands of pages of documentation on this topic, by the standards that I'm familiar with, in the sciences at least, this is rational discussion. Now, maybe he knows something else. If so, I'd be glad to hear it. I've occasionally tried to find from these people what their criticisms are. Well, let me give you a real case. One of the I had an article which appeared in a pretty obscure place, the Institute for Media Analysis publication, which nobody's ever seen, in which, among other things, I went through New York Times and Washington Post opinion pieces during the period of the most intense debate over Nicaragua, and I simply analyzed the range of opinion that was expressed. And it turned out it ranged between those who thought you have to overthrow the Sandinistas by violence and the doves who said, no, you have to control them and impose regional arrangements on them and contain them and so on by some other means, not violence, but say economic pressures or whatever. That was the range of discussion. For example, there was not one phrase in these columns pointing out that whatever you think about the Sandinistas, they were different from the states we support in that they don't slaughter their population. That sounds like a relevant point in the discussion. Nobody even mentioned that. In all of these columns, this is 85 columns over 3 months, there were 2 phrases noting that, in fact, they had carried out social reforms until we stopped them. That's all. Nothing about their neutralist foreign policy, nothing about the trading patterns before we imposed the blockade. I mean, none of the relevant facts were discussed. Those were the limits of debate. Well, Tom Wicker, who's leading media at Dove, at the end of each year has a kind of a mea culpa column in the New York Times where he sort of goes over the mistakes he's made that year. And in that year, 1987, in his wrap-up end-of-the-year column, he devoted a substantial part of the column to denouncing me personally for this article. He said, a reader has brought to my attention, this report. And then he said, it's sort of like Greenfield, it's wacko. I mean, nobody tells me what to write. And besides, I don't see why I should defend I don't have to be a Sandinista party hack anyway, which was not the issue. I made it extremely clear that the question was not the honesty or even the accuracy of the reports, but rather the range of opinion expressed. And then he went on to say something like this. He said, analysis by foot rule and calculator can be just as misleading as the media that it attempts to deal with or something. And just sort of dismissal and, foaming at the mouth. Well, I was curious, so I wrote him a letter and I said, I read your column attacking my article. Could you, I'm curious to know if you apparently had some methodological critique or some other critique. Could you tell me what the critique was? I'd like to do it better next time. No answer, of course. I then wrote him back another letter in which I made it more brief. I said, I have the following 2 questions. You said so-and-so. What's your reason for it? No answer. I finally sent him a 3rd letter and said, look, answer one simple question, yes or no. Have you ever seen the article that you criticized? Of course, the answer is no. I never got an answer. Now, the point is that you're dealing with hysterics. These are people who can't even answer they are perfectly willing to attack someone in public who they know can't respond, but they're unwilling even to write a private letter saying, I read your article before I attacked it, or I had a reason or I didn't have a reason. Now, that's unheard of in the sciences, or in any rational discipline, or, among rational people, that's unheard of. And I think it explains what's going on. They simply refuse to enter the arena of discussion. So, for example, if you had time and had asked Greenfield, what's wacko about show me where it's wacko. Is it wrong about, say, the Tet Offensive? We have a long chapter on the coverage of the Tet Offensive. Is it incorrect? Well, if it's incorrect, where is it incorrect? Then what you would discover very quickly is he never read anything beyond the title. He saw the title, and he says, that's not the way it works. It's wacko, so the end of it. And in fact, that's my strong suspicion. You could try asking him.
Well, we have here one of the most liberal and one of the most thoughtful and intelligent people in mainstream media who's giving us this particular line. You've spoken about the importance of democratizing the country, and I assume also the flow of information. We need to have a truly democratic delivery of information to people. Given this incredible chasm between those who control the flow of information for the mass media, and I understand that 70% of Americans get all or most of their consumption of news and analysis from these sorts of sources, mainstream sources. What hope is there ever of democratizing the flow of information if, given this chasm?
Well, I think there's lots of hope. It's a very free country. There's few measures that can be used to forcefully coerce people, which means you have a big range of options. For one thing, there are alternative media like this. So you can ask Greenfield those questions, and if you had time, you could have even pursued it, which would be very interesting. It'd be interesting to try to pursue it and find out what his reasons are.
But they would never tolerate that. I was lucky to get 15 minutes.
Yeah, okay. Well, was that on this radio? Oh, they would not agree to talk that long.
That's all I could get.
Yeah, I understand, yeah. Well, see, that's a measure of self-protection, too, because in 15 minutes you're just going to be able to get the curse words, not the reasons. But other people can do it. Like, for example, but to say, people can write them letters. They can demand answers. They can picket the office. There's a lot of ways of pressuring people to give responses. And they do respond. I mean, they are concerned with their audience. If the audience becomes sufficiently disruptive, they will respond in some fashion.
So you're saying they can be influenced?
They can be influenced the way power can be influenced, by changing the conditions within which it operates. They want a receptive, obedient, passive audience. In fact, if they don't have it, they're going to be in real trouble because their advertisers aren't going to support them. And if their audience is not meeting those conditions, they're going to have to somehow deal with that situation the same way the government does when there's too much turmoil. When the government, say, goes underground to try to prevent the population from knowing what it's doing. That's a way of influencing policy, creating conditions under which they have to act differently. Then you can simply participate in and support alternative media, which do it differently. And don't forget, there are people in the media who are much more perceptive about what goes on than Jeff Greenfield. There are people in the media who understand very well the way it works and who try to search for the opportunities that appear here and there to move something in or change something and so on. They can be supported. But the main thing that you have to start with self-protection and self-education. You have to understand the way convince yourself about the way the system works, and find ways to undermine, to question its assumptions. First, to recognize its assumptions, then to question their accuracy, and then to proceed. That is very few people are capable of doing that on their own. It takes a lot of resources and commitment. It's much easier to do it in a group. So the audience of listener-supported radio, say, is a group. They can interact. And a point of view can be sustained and developed over time, which becomes important and meaningful. It isn't very meaningful to hear something, even for half an hour. Suppose somebody can express an opinion in a half an hour and really develop it. Well, even that isn't very meaningful unless it's repeated and developed and thought about and challenged and answered and so on. It doesn't really become part of your worldview. The propaganda that's provided in the major media gains its force partially by repetition. Since you hear the same thing over and over again, your mind gets dulled. And it's only if alternatives are constructed that are sustained, in which people contribute and which they challenge and question and develop and so on. It's only then that an alternative culture of dissidence or culture of critical intelligence can develop. So it requires organization, unification, participation. In fact, it requires exactly the kinds of public bodies that would lead to general democratization of the social system.
But wouldn't that threaten the existence of these mainstream...
But that's exactly what we ought to threaten. We ought to threaten
that's
concentrated power.
But isn't that why they would never, ever permit that democratization to occur for that very reason?
Well, the question, I think at some point they would prevent it. But I think they're very far from that point. I mean, I think they can tolerate much more openness and debate and discussion without threatening the foundations of state capitalism. I mean, take a look at the European countries, for example, which do permit much more. Or Canada, it's very similar to the United States. They do, in fact, tolerate much more discussion and debate. They do not, for example, have the constraints that he was talking about, which require conventionality, and nevertheless, power remains. I think it leads to it helps educate and civilize the population, but there's give in the system. But beyond that, the system has no right to exist. We should be challenging the right of concentrated corporations to determine what happens. That should not be permitted in the economic sphere or the political sphere or the ideological sphere or any other sphere. And that means creating alternatives and challenging their dominance. Ultimately, that is going to mean challenging the economic basis for their ownership of the systems of communication. That's serious. Now you're talking about significant social change, and we're very far from that. But there's no reason why we shouldn't move towards it.
But if it will only be permitted, this sort of free-flowing, truly democratized public debate of issues, if it will only be permitted up to the point where it's not going to have any effect.
Not going to have any effect. It's not going to challenge the foundations of power. So, I mean, look, reform measures are tolerated, and they're good. Social Security, for example, was tolerated. It cuts into the income of corporations. But nevertheless, they were willing to tolerate it to keep the workforce quiet and obedient and so on. It's a good thing. I'm glad there is Social Security. There can be improvements and changes without changing the fundamental institutional structure of the society. And I think it's always worth working for those changes while understanding that there are deeper changes that are appropriate and essential, which will challenge institutional structures and will require a level of commitment, organization, and understanding that we have yet to attain.
Presumably, this democratization of the public debate could also lead to what you've called for a reorientation of our values towards service, caring, stewardship of the land, all of those things that if that doesn't happen, we're not likely to survive. Is that the case that the democratization of public discourse could have that powerful of an effect?
Well, I think that's a very serious question. I mean, I think it is under current conditions. Things go on the way they are with the same operative values and the same systems of power and coercion and so on. It's very unlikely that human civilization will survive very long. It's long been understood that any society that's driven by greed is going to self-destruct for quite simple reasons. I mean, it can go on as long as the scale of production and consumption is relatively small, that is small relative to the nature of the environment. If you can pretend that the world is an infinite wastebasket and that the world has infinite resources, then a society can survive, however ugly it may be, on the basis of maximization of short-term personal gain. But those assumptions are flatly false. And anybody who thought always knew that they were false. For a while, you could pretend that they were more or less correct. It's a matter of scale. We're now reaching the point when you can't pretend it any longer. We're reaching the point when the pretense that the world is an infinite wastebasket is not going to work. It's going to impinge on our lives, and seriously. And the belief that the world is an infinite resource is not going to work. These are questions of scale. And we're at that point. Now, nobody can give an exact date, but within the foreseeable future, measurable in generations, maybe even a generation, these are problems that are going to seriously affect human life. And we are therefore going to have to challenge the assumption that maximization of short-term gain is an adequate value for driving a social system, and it isn't. There's got to be ways of supporting alternative other components of human personality, concern solidarity, concern cooperation, and so on. And these are not going to come. These changes are not going to come out of hierarchic and authoritarian structures, because they're inimical to their very nature. They might come out of a fuller democratization of the society. I don't think there's a guarantee that they will come. It's only that that's the only way that they might come. And it's for this reason that I think that democratization of the society, including the media, is not only a value in itself that should be upheld, but also may be the only possible instrument for ensuring that the human race has a future.
And in conclusion, the role of the control of the media in achieving those positive goals?
Control of the media, democratization of the media means public access and public determination of what they are and what they do. And I don't, as I say, I think that's an end in itself, just like political democracy is an end in itself. But it also is while again it does not guarantee overcoming the massive problems that we face, it's the only hope for doing so. And therefore, there's another reason why it has to be pursued, and pursued in real time, not 10 generations from now, but in the short term.
Well, we should leave it there for now. You've got to run to another appointment, but maybe we can pick up by phone.
Yeah.
Noam Chomsky, thank you very much.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Talk about that. How'd you get this crown here? He came to deliver a lecture, and I went to the press conference and tried to get in as many questions as I could, which would, if you can get him, be very interesting. See, it's nobody's ever checked on what he and Charles Russ were doing. Why did they avoid it? Oh, sure. Maybe, I guess that's where we should pick up when we do a phone one. Because I'd like to ask him a big question.